Hey guys, welcome to Your Best Interviews. My name is Eric Smith. Thank you so much for spending the time here with me. I know that there's so many different places you can go to get information, and so I appreciate you spending it here. What I want to talk about now is how to specifically prepare for behavioral based interview questions and how to absolutely crush them in your next upcoming interview. So, behavioral based questions, this is probably the one that I get the most from the people that I work with that stress them out because behavioral based interview questions are very specific questions where you have to actually pull from your past experiences and answer their question in the best way possible. A lot of people stress over this because you have to think on your feet. Within a couple of seconds, you have to recall the best possible story for the question that they ask you. There is a very specific way to prepare for this and to absolutely crush when these questions come your way. It's important to remember that they only have a limited amount of time, right? Most interviews are only 30 to 60 minutes. And so when they start asking you questions or when they get into the meat of the interview and the behavioral based questions start coming, typically they don't have enough time to ask you 10 or 15, right? So really what you need to prepare for is to be able to answer anywhere from 3 to maybe 5 behavioral based interview questions because they're going to ask the question and then you're going to give your answer kind of telling the story, and that's going to take time. And so when you stack those up, all of a sudden it consumes a good amount of the interview time. So it's not like they're going to ask you unlimited questions. It's always good to practice all different types of behavioral based questions that can come your way. But the specific way to make sure that you're crushing these is to come up with your own chameleon stories. So what is a chameleon story? A chameleon story is a story that can shift and mold to different types of questions that would come your way. It has to be a real story. If you're making up a story, that's wrong because you're lying. And if they're asking specifics about your background and you're making stuff up, you're falsifying your fit for that role, which you don't want to do, right? But the other side is if you are making these things up, it's really hard to recall the specific details in your own made up story, right? So make sure it's a real story. Think about your past experiences. It doesn't always have to be work related, but think about these different types of experiences that pertain to why you would be a good fit. Typically they are work related, or maybe it's maybe if you're a recent grad, maybe it's a school project or something like that. Potentially it can be like a sports team type thing, whatever is most relevant to you based on your years of experience and your past. But what you want to think about are stories that have multiple elements to them. So what I mean by this is if I asked you, tell me about a time that you had to work with a difficult person, you could probably think of a lot of different stories, right? Now, if I asked you, think about a time that you had to overcome a challenge. My guess is that you can think about a story in your past where you were working on something at work or in a school project where there was a difficult person and you had to overcome a different challenge within, right? Maybe it's you had to learn a new skill or you had to overcome power outage and losing whatever. What I'm trying to get at is you have different elements to the same story, right? So maybe you're using a school project. Let's use that for an example. And I asked you, tell me about a time you worked with a difficult person. You can quickly reference that story and associate and kind of tell the story shaped around the difficult person that you worked with on that group project. Now, let's say instead of asking you, tell me about a time you worked with a difficult person, I ask you, tell me about a time you had to learn something completely new. Maybe in that group project, and I don't know, but maybe in that group project, you did have to overcome and learn a different software. Maybe you had to learn a different program altogether to fulfill your piece of that group project. That's an element that you can now tell that same story about a difficult person, but just you're telling it in a different way to highlight that overcoming that difficult situation. Now, if I ask you another question, maybe it's tell me about a time you failed. Within that same story, was there something that you did or that you were pursuing that failed, right? That you had to overcome, you had to navigate around. That's a chameleon story. It's got multiple elements so that if I ask you one question, you could pull out 3 or 4 different behavioral based type questions that would come your way and you tell that same story, but just really tailor it towards the question that they're asking. That's a chameleon story. Now, what you want to do to make sure that you're in the driver's seat is you want to think of as many chameleon stories as you can, right? But I would say at the minimum, you should come up with 5 chameleon stories. 5 chameleon stories that have a lot of different elements to them. And then as you're practicing, go through the list of behavioral based questions. Just you can Google, or it's on my website. I've got an interview prep course kit that has all the behavioral based questions in there that you can prepare for. But you should be thinking about every single behavioral based question that could come your way. And then quickly in your head, you know that there's 5 main stories that you're going to be referencing, right? You're just going to pick and choose which stories are best based on the question that comes your way. Story number 4 might be way better suited to a particular type of behavioral-based question than story 1. And so when they ask you that question, you can take a minute to really think, right? Look down. It's okay to take a couple seconds to think. But what you're doing, instead of going through your Rolodex of thousands of previous stories that you could be referencing, all you're doing is going through those 5, right? And picking in your mind which of those five stories that you've already prepared is the best that you can tell the story to answer the question that they're asking. And that's a chameleon story. It's a real story. You're just focusing on different elements within to answer the question that they're asking. And the reason I say prepare 5 is because if you do have enough time for them to ask you 5 behavioral-based questions, you don't always have to use the same story. Now, it's okay. I've been asked behavioral-based questions where I've gone back to the same story. And I'll say, actually, within that previous story I just told you, or that previous situation we talked about, there was a great example of this where I think, it really highlighted that. And it's okay to use the same story, but if you're using the same story over and over and over, it seems like you don't have a lot of experience. So have 5 ready and make sure all 5 have a lot of different elements. And if you're not sure what elements you need to prepare or have as a component within that story, start looking at behavioral-based questions and start thinking through what are the questions that could come my way. And as you start to think about, all right, that I could probably use this story for that type of question, perhaps that's a chameleon story. Then once you write down, okay, that's one of the stories I think I'll reference, think about all the elements within that story that you could quickly reference if needed, right? So you should have 5 different stories that you're thinking about as your chameleon stories, and then bullet out the different elements within those same stories and study those. Study how to talk about those. As you're practicing for behavioral-based questions and giving your answers, answer in a way where you're referencing each element across those 5 chameleon stories that best suit the question that comes your way. Hopefully this was helpful, guys. I know this is quick and it seems high level, but chameleon stories are, it's a huge, huge asset. It puts you in the driver's seat. It takes away a lot of interview nerves because if you know going in which stories you're going to already use, you're just going to really be choosing which of the 5 is best based on the question asked. And you've already done your prep for behavioral-based questions that can come your way. You know that they're not really going to stump you, right? So you're in the driver's seat. It helps lower a lot of nerves because you're not worried about being stumped on the spot. So practice these. If you need more information on chameleon stories, check out all of my resources. I have an entire interview course centered on giving you as much information at every step in the process. My goal is to help in every aspect. And so chameleon stories is a huge, huge asset when preparing for in-person interviews, because behavioral-based questions will come your way. And then the other thing, last thing I'll leave you with, and it's not going to be in this video, you can check out my other video on this, but look up the STAR method. Look up how to answer behavioral-based questions using the STAR method. It's relatively easy, but some interviews might ask you to answer behavioral-based questions using a STAR method. But if they don't, it's still a really good way for you to structure your answer around the STAR method: situation, task, action, result. So if you want more on that, check out my other video on the STAR method. I'll link it in this at the very end. But guys, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate you. Check out everything else. And if this is helpful, guys, hit subscribe. I drop 2 videos every week, Monday and Wednesday. And leave a comment. If there's more information that you want or you want more detail, I'm doing 2 videos every week. And all of my content is centered around helping you get the job that you really want. Thanks, guys.